The government allows 500 members of an Afghan Special Forces unit who fought against the Taliban to settle in the UK. That's the plan. Now, thousands of former members of two elite units who served alongside the British Army applied to settle in the UK following the fall of Kabul in 2021, but were turned down because there was a lack of direct evidence of their service. But following re-examination, around 500 of those original 2,000 cases could now be accepted. Well, is this fair for those who supported our armed forces, or could there be risk of a national heightened security risk? To discuss this, I'm now joined by the former Royal Tank Regiment veteran James Cameron, who served in Afghanistan alongside some of those gentlemen. James, welcome to the show. So can I ask you quite simply, do you think these servicemen who served for Britain deserve to be allowed into the UK?
I think you've answered your own question, Martin, and thank you for having us on. These are servicemen who served Britain. Of course, they should be allowed into the UK. I think the real question we should be asking ourselves is why has this not happened sooner? Why, when the fall of Afghanistan happened, was the ability for them to look after both themselves and their families not put in place at an earlier point? These are people who we fought alongside, who we routinely trusted, and they trusted us with their lives, comrades in arms. It's difficult to understand, really, what better sort of people we could hope to bring into the country.
And James Cameron, tell me about the kinds of people who were fighting and what their motivations were. They were Afghans who were repelled by the Taliban regime, right? And they decided to flip sides. I mean, what kind of people are we talking about? Tell us about the individuals and their moral fortitude.
Well, these are fairly extraordinary individuals. Obviously, you're talking about a country that was under Taliban rule until 2001, when my first tour of Afghanistan began. And I was last there in 2011 in Helmand, commanding the armoured group. A lot of these are young men. So they've grown up for their majority of lives with sisters who went to school, who were able to have freedom of education, freedom of speech, able to fly kites, play music, do lots of things which we take for granted. They're incredibly westernized, as we would sort of think and look at them. These are not the bearded savages that I think it's easy to kind of imagine when one thinks of these terrible places a long way away. For 20 years, we developed Afghanistan's own armed forces, and some extraordinary people stepped forward in order to serve at not inconsiderable personal risk to themselves and their families. When they were left behind, then I think they've undergone the most extraordinary risks on behalf of effectively serving the interests of the Crown. And so, from my perspective, it hurt when we had to leave people behind. It hurt when we did that, and I think the moral injury that was felt by many servicemen and women who'd served in Afghanistan felt the same. A security risk from bringing such people across to this country. Of course, you have to take everything with a certain degree of caution. But in terms of starting with moral fibre and people who have already risked their own lives hugely in defence of what we hold dear, they're an exceptional audience, and we should do all we can to be able to support them.
And in that sense, James Cameron, what you're saying to us, very passionately, and thank you, and it's so fascinating to get an insight into the theatre of war and the types of people on the ground who we're not dealing with uniformity of thought here, are we? We're dealing with people whose own lives were turned upside down by the Taliban regime and have undergone great personal risk to fight against them. And presumably that means that they are in grave danger by even being in the country now at all.
Absolutely, Martin. And what was so tragic is that many lost their lives through the Afghan withdrawal and continue to live at great risk. Many have had to relocate. Some are in neighbouring countries to Afghanistan who've had to flee altogether, having lost family members, lost all which they had and possessed. If we group people by religion and talk about people as Islamists, we've just got to remember that we fought the Second World War against a Christian nation. It is wrong to tar all those underneath the same thing. Of course, whenever something is imported into this country, we have to ensure that the right security measures are followed. But goodness me, these are people who fought in the interest of the crown alongside our own soldiers. They depended on us for their lives, just as we depended on them.
Absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much for giving us your insight. And I'd always like to say thank you for your service and putting your neck on the line for the country. Thank you very much. Royal Tank Regiment veteran James Cameron. An absolute pleasure to speak to you today on GB News. You take care, mate. Best of British. Now, David Lammy has become the first Foreign Secretary since Brexit to attend a regular meeting of EU ministers. Why? He called yesterday's meeting in Luxembourg an historic moment that marks Britain's reset with the bloc. Well, the Foreign Office says UK attendance at the meeting would be part of more regular engagement as they focus their work on international affairs. But should we be cozying up to the EU? And could this so-called reset end up tying us to years of more treaties and red tape? Well, I can now speak with Thierry Baudet, who is the leader of the Dutch Forum for Democracy Party. Welcome to the show, Thierry. Always a pleasure to have your company. What on earth is going on with the United Kingdom? I mean, I thought we voted to leave back in 2019. Why do you think Brussels are trying to snare Britain back in?
Well, because they were never able to accept the result of the referendum in the first place. I remember very well, and this is my most important message, people across the continent were cheering for the Brits. There's a lot of support for Brexit, and when the referendum happened on June 23rd, 2016, it took years for Britain to get out of the grip of the EU, in part, of course, because of the political establishment within Britain didn't want to give a follow-up on the popular result. And so what they're now trying to do is, through the back door, tie Britain again into the European straitjacket. And it's undemocratic, but it's also very unwise for your country, because finally you now have the chance, you have the opportunity, being a sovereign nation once again, to connect yourselves with the rest of the world and to grow and to have an international outlook. And instead, Lammy and your current government want to tie your country to the only trading bloc in the world that is declining and declining every year. It's an unwise policy, and it comes from elites that are still incapable of accepting the outcome of the referendum of 2016.
Thierry, could I ask you about the political landscape in the Netherlands? I find it absolutely fascinating. There's a backlash in your nation to the European Union, to open borders, to Schengen, and you've had terrible problems with Islamist terror attacks. We've seen that across the bloc. The Netherlands now is leading the way in a backlash. 15 nations signed a letter against Brussels in terms of border control, in terms of clamping down on terror, in terms of refusing to accept quotas on asylum seekers. Tell us about the political mood in Netherlands and what got you to where you are.
Well, I think the people are slowly coming to realize that there is no way to seriously limit immigration unless one is willing to consider leaving the European Union. And that the very fundamental point of the European integration has been to dilute nation states, to weaken sovereignty, and to tie us into a European, a pan-continental bureaucracy. So whichever way you try to change the European regulations, the answer is always going to be no. And there's always only one direction, which is more integration. So if you're really serious about controlling your immigration, controlling your borders, making your own trade deals, setting your own rules and regulations and taxation and so on and so forth, then at some point you're going to have to talk about, hey, is the European Union itself maybe the problem? And that's, I think, what is beginning to happen now across the continent.
Thierry, would you mind if I indulge myself for a moment and showed a quick video of myself when I was an MEP on the opening day of our term? You might recall, there we are, turning our backs on the European Union national anthem.
Excellent.
Now, Thierry, we were lambasted for this, of course. They were frothing at the mouth at the BBC and the liberal media because we dared to do the thing they hate the most. We didn't take them seriously. We refused to take their anthem seriously. They're not a nation. Why have they got a national anthem? They're not a country. Why have they got a flag? We did that to them. For that, of course, we were compared to the fascists simply by saying, we don't accept your tin pot fake bureaucracy. We led the way. And I want to ask you, Thierry, you saluted Brexit. You said you were doing cartwheels there at The Hague. Is there any appetite in your country for Nexit, for a Netherlands version of Brexit?
Well, I wouldn't be afraid to put the question to the people. If you look at current opinion polls, then you wouldn't see a clear majority. But the very point of having referenda is that the people, for the first time, will become aware of such questions. They will realize they can actually vote yes or no. And a national debate will start to take shape. And that's the very thing that our elites are most afraid of. That is why they seek to censor the internet. That is why they are afraid of news outlets like the ones I'm currently on. The only way to control current policies is by controlling the narrative, and referendums break through those narratives. So I would be confident putting the question in front of the people, and I've always said that I would be, quite accepting if the people would say, we want to stay in the EU. We want to continue to pay with our pension reserves for the debts in the South. We're happy to have open borders for the rest of our history. Okay, the Dutch have chosen. But the thing that is most difficult to accept for me, and I think this is a sentiment that is increasingly being felt across Europe, is that we've never been able to say yes or no. Quite the contrary, the Dutch said no in 2016 to the further extension of the European Union with ever more nations within the framework. We said no back in 2005 to the European Convention, the European Constitution that was proposed. So whenever the people get the chance, they say no. And that is probably why referendums are so rarely found these days in Europe, because they're quite afraid of the answer.